Welcome to a short information session on greenhouse gas emissions, specifically Scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1 emissions, which are direct emissions, are the direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the company. An example of this could be the transport used by the company to move goods and services. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions. These generally are the emissions released into the atmosphere from the use of purchased energy. So these are called indirect emissions because they're actually emissions generated at another facility, such as a power station. Scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions, are a little bit harder to scope and also measure. Scope 3 emissions will be the last to be included in emissions reports, however, are very important along the value chain or supply chain for companies looking to do business either internationally, with governments or with large organisations. Scope 3 emissions are also indirect emissions. Scope 3 emissions include all other indirect emissions that occur across the value chain or supply chain and are outside of the organisation's direct control. Some examples may be employees commuting to and from work, the energy used or emissions used for business travel and transport that is not owned by the company. Scope 3 emissions for a large organisation will be passed down the supply chain. SMEs and smaller emitters, Scope 1 and 2, will be considered in the end user Scope 3 emissions expectations and targets. The greenhouse gas emissions Scope 1, 2 and 3 is a complicated process, and we recommend companies that do need to report on this undertaking a little bit more training. This Scope 1, 2, 3 and greenhouse gas emissions topic is covered in our climate change maturity assessment and would be a very welcome tool for companies trying to understand where they are on their climate change journey.